So this is the International Human Dimensions Program on Global Environmental Change. It's a rather long title. The acronym is IHDP. It was founded in 1996 on the initiative of UNESCO's International Social Science Council and the International Council for Science, ICSO. It is nowadays a program of 3 institutional parents. Other than the 2 mentioned, the United Nations University is also an institutional owner and sponsor of IHDP. The IHDP is a network of networks with a central scientific committee, a secretariat, various project offices around the world. I'll come back to that in a minute. We had an external evaluation just 2 years ago, which stated that IHDP managed to successfully develop an international research program and enhance the involvement of the social sciences in global change issues, especially global environmental change issues, and has managed to build a distinctive global research community. Our vision is to provide global leadership in framing, developing, and integrating social science research on global change, and to promote the application of our key findings to help address the challenges of global change. So, global change, of course, encompasses to a large extent global environmental change, which is not only climate change, but really dominated by that. And I think it is fair to say that IHDP has managed to brand its science as the global leading network of social scientists, including the economists and also to some extent humanities and behavioral sciences, and their methodological and intelligent or intellectual contributions to global change research. We are working within a framework which is identified as the Earth System Science Partnership, and that is a interdisciplinary framework where the social science are. We do have a mandate in terms of enhancing governance models and tools worldwide, decision support, informing and listening to policymakers, which I think is also in your interest. So the mission is, first of all, research, cutting edge, high-quality research. We are promoting it, catalyzing it. We are also, to some extent, carrying it out in our projects. And then we contribute, that is the second mission statement, to the, I mentioned that before, the interdisciplinary attempts. And we've come a long way. I think a decade ago, it was still quite a difficult task to undertake, to really do research together with natural scientists on issues around the biophysical determinants of climate change and so on, but also I think we've been part of an exciting movement towards a real cross-disciplinary undertaking. And then we do capacity development. That is our third mission statement, through various summer schools, and workshops, and national committees, and training young elites. And last but certainly not least, we facilitate the dialogue between science and policy, including corporate policies, not only government policies. Our science is governed by a scientific committee, and yes, here are 2 very prominent chairs. The management is, global coordination is done by the Secretariat, based at the United Nations offices in Bonn, Germany. Here are again in orange our 3 pillars, strategic pillars: capacity building, cutting edge science, and science policy. We have a whole number of projects, and I'll get back to them now. But these projects are clustered a little bit around 4 cross-cutting themes. That is how I like to start. Vulnerability, resilience, adaptation is one clustered cross-cutting themes. That means that issues around resilience of coupled social, ecological systems, adaptation to global change, and vulnerability assessment, and so forth, that is really cutting truly across all sorts of sectoral and other thematic projects. Then there is a typo here, governments means governance. So the governance, and that is particularly relevant for the Hertie school, and the role of institutions in a larger sense is another cross-cutting theme, important for all IHDP research. Then the work on social learning and knowledge, both formal and informal knowledge systems, their application, co-production of knowledge, and collective learning and behavioral changes are also cross-cutting. And last but not least, thresholds, transitions, tipping points, not only in the ecosystems but also in institutions and in societal setups. Now, to the projects, it is by now a whole portfolio. I spare you the acronyms, but just to give you a few examples, we do research on human security and environmental change. Then on sectoral themes such as land, water, health, the global carbon cycle. We do research on industrial transformation and sustainability, pathways and experiments, land-ocean interactions in the coastal zone, urbanization and global environmental change, and a few others. Applying certain methodologies that are common within the social sciences, but also testing and experimenting with new methodologies that are there to foster the interaction with the natural sciences, and that is a huge challenge in itself. In the first phase of IHDP, the program chose somewhat to be restricted to the environmental governance and environmental sphere in itself. Now in the second phase, the second decade of our operations, we are reaching out more to establish major social science discourses and disciplines such as gender, poverty, equity, development studies, and public goods. You know, who likes to hear that, I guess. And so this is becoming a broader agenda now in the second phase. We just established last year and approved a strategic plan to guide our work for the next 10 years, and under this strategic plan we identified a new set of research initiatives that we are currently launching. I will name them in the next slide, but also we decided to give the cross-cutting themes a life of their own, so that we don't only mainstream those themes, but actually research them more in depth and breadth. We are currently enhancing our science policy mandate, being now part of the UN system. Of course, it's self-evident that we are exposed to a number of processes. Just to name two, of course, we are a part of the IPCC. Many of our authors were lead authors for Working Group 2, but also Working Group 3 in the last IPCC report. We are now engaging in a bilateral undertaking aiming to address social science research gaps and then to enhance the performance of the next IPCC report and make it more integrated, holistic. So forth, we have a standing relationship with UNFCCC and so forth. But also more and more actively engaged in dialogue with UN member states, if you will. I mentioned capacity development, and here are new science initiatives, and that then will later be picked up by Oran again in his presentation. Earth system governance, as I said in the beginning, is the successor in a way of our institutional dimensions project. And as I said before, I think this is interesting for the Hertie school in general. We're perceiving the Earth system as a coupled system of the ecosphere and the human sphere. And this kind of novel governance research tries to cut across those two and look at those two realms in a way. So we aim really to incorporate the natural sciences into our type of governance research. The Integrated Risk Governance Project is a second governance-related project. We are just kick-starting, looking not so much at risk management issues, but really at the broader picture of integrated risk governance. So clusters of risks that usually or often and more often occur in an interdependent mode. For instance, when a tsunami hits, it is not just this type of risk. There are health risks, there are economic risks, there are energy security risks, there are financial risks combined with it. So we try to integrate all that in one perspective. Vulnerability, resilience, adaptation, I mentioned it before. Knowledge and social learning is something that we are now starting as well. We've had very interesting preliminary workshops, one in Berlin here at the Wissenschaftszentrum in February. Recently I had workshops at Harvard and Columbia, and so we are reaching out broadly and put this together, and by next year, sometime in spring, we'll be able to report how this is going to look like. And a few others. So, Arild.
Thank you. Could I ask you to navigate in the... I'll stand up. It's not important that you see me, but you can hear me more easily if I stand up. What I thought I'd do is share with you a few highlights from the research that's been undertaken on the role of institutions. And I think we can just immediately... Maybe actually you could...
Should I? I can.
You can do this, of course. Just switch immediately to slide 2, please. So the study of institutions. Institutions here understood primarily as systems of rules, norms, and practices that are involved in performing governance functions, rather than organizations understood as material entities. Now, there is a question being raised in some of the political science literature specifically, are institutions at all significant elements in governance? And the answer on the basis of the research that's been undertaken within this program and related activities is clearly yes, in a generic sense, institutions are important. We can prove that they are important deductively by, for example, analyzing the difference in actor behavior under a system of open access to common pooled resources compared to a system in which there is regulated access, for instance. It can, in that sense, be proved that making such a change of rules from open access to restricted access will change behavior and may change outcomes. So deductive analysis proves, quotation marks, that institutions can be important in certain circumstances. Empirical studies provide compelling evidence that in some cases institutions make a significant difference, and in others they don't. And here's my interesting point, because some of the case study literature seems to come to conclusions that highlight the role of institutions more than extensive statistical analysis. This is one of the puzzles, I think, currently. Those who engage in intensive case studies tend to ask the question now, what kind of role did this particular institution play in this particular process or setting? And they go into they look at the engine and see how it works and make inferences about its impact. There's a study change extensively by means of statistical multivariate analysis. They ask, now, how can we explain this particular outcome? If we consider a vessel that is moving, those who really focus on institutions in terms of case studies would often look at the engine, see how it works, and then make certain kinds of inferences. The statistical extensive analysis would go out and see that the vessel has moved from X to Y, and ask now, what made that vessel move? Now, the engine certainly might have some role in that, but so could current, so could wind, and there are other forces. And so this is one of the interesting challenges right now, is to try to see, to look at these different modes of research, because they tend to produce, in some cases at least, slightly different results. And also, and this is important, that government, you will have noticed that some of the literature asks important questions of the type, can common pool problems, can the tragedy of the commons be avoided in any other way than through central government? Can democracy, can a combination of liberal democracy and market economies cope with the kind of problems that we are, sustainability problems, global environmental governance problems that we're facing today? Well, the answer is that we do indeed have several important results showing that governance without central government is possible. Not that it will work in all circumstances, by no means, but there are circumstances in which it produces results that are much better than those who argue, like Hertie and Offels and other for central government would expect. Next, please. Let me highlight 4 achievements that I see as important in this areas of study, and this will have to be done very quickly. I think one of the most important achievements that's been made in this research is that I think we can say that we have a better understanding of some of the causal mechanisms at work through which institutions shape behavior in outcomes. And I've highlighted 3 different components of that formula here. First of all, knowledge. One of the things that organizations and regimes do is bring actors together to develop a common platform of consensual knowledge. Now that does not always succeed, but sometimes it does. And one of the important results that we see coming out of international organized cooperation is in fact convergence when it comes to the diagnosis of the problem, the understanding of its causes, the understanding of the menu for choice when it comes to policy options. So regimes and organizations often contribute significantly to the development of a base of consensual knowledge. We actually here today to compare and contrast results from 2 measure extensive studies of international regimes, one in which Oran, Mikael and Helmut have been involved, one in which I have been involved with Norwegian and American colleagues. And one of the results that come out very clearly of both of these is this form of now, incentives, I will not talk extensively about incentives, but if you ask economists how institutions work, they will clearly point to the role of institutions in changing incentives. And we do in fact see that this is an important role. There is also, and if you go to the so-called constructivists, they would say that, well, institutions change behavior also by changing identities or having parties internalize certain norms, routines, etc. And indeed, we do see institutions, regimes, organizations working through these mechanisms as well. I think one of the good news, actually, one of the one thing that can be said in favor of this community of research is that it has not, to the extent that we've seen in some other areas, engaged in what I would call sterile posturing of constructivism versus rationalism. There's been the general understanding that institutions can work through different mechanisms. Then it is an empirical question, in any particular case, which one is the stronger, or how the 2 combine to produce results. Next one. The other major achievement that I want to highlight is that we are beginning to see and beginning to gain improved knowledge and understanding of patterns of variance, particularly when it comes to regime performance or regime effectiveness. We are beginning to see patterns of explanations. We can point to certain recurring patterns. As a consequence, I think we are at least beginning to be able to talk about regime design. Now, this is a very, I think those of us who are present here would be inclined to be modest. We wouldn't claim to come up and say, here we have the recipe, and you can buy it for $50 or whatever at the bookstore at the airport. We're not there. Discount. We're not there yet, but we're beginning to see certain, on the basis of these patterns, we're beginning to see that you can do this, you can do that, and one of the things that is emerging very clearly is that we need to match the recipe with the diagnosis. Now, one of the things that some of the recommendation literature suffers from is overgeneralization. Sort of pinpointing, say, a set of design principles that are presumed to apply under all circumstances. Now, I think we would say there are very few, if any, such principles, but there are guidelines that we might connect to particular kinds of problems or challenges. In that sense, we have no cure-all medicine, but we are beginning to see that if you suffer from this particular disease, it might help to do X. On the other hand, if you suffer from that disease, maybe it's better to do Y. Next, please. Much of the early research on the role of institutions dealt with single institutions understood as standalone arrangements. One particular regime, one particular organization, and we study the impact of that particular organization. We've always recognized, of course, that there are multiple institutions, to some extent connected, and that if we want to explain governance in a broader sense, we need to understand the interplay of institutions. And we need to understand also how institutional complexes work. If we want to understand global environmental governance, for example, we need to understand how those institutions that regulate international trade and investments interact with, for example, the Biodiversity Convention and other conventions that are, or other regimes that are specifically geared to protect some environmental value. If we analyze only the latter, we will get a distorted picture of the institutional mechanisms affecting the outcome. So, and this is one of the areas in which I would say the institutional dimensions project that Oran has been leading has really made a difference. Next, please. And this is the final one. I have some slides pertaining to challenges and problems, but I'll leave those for the Q&A period if necessary. I think we're beginning to see what I've called more ambitious and sophisticated use of the methodological repertoire of social science. Much of the research in this area is intensive case studies research, providing lots of information, detailed accounts of a particular case, be it a particular regime, a particular organization, or a particular field, substantive field. We're beginning to see now more, I would say, more sophisticated, ambitious yardsticks for measuring performance, for example. I have been involved in the construction of one of these yardsticks. It's often referred to as the Oslo-Potsdam solution, which is heavily criticized in the literature. Yet, it is an example of a conceptual construct that is trying to provide a framework for studying performance. There may be other and better solutions coming up, but we see these efforts being made at constructing these kind of yardsticks that enable us to systematically measure and compare performance. We're beginning to see, in addition to qualitative case studies, we see more refined statistical analysis, for example, multivariate analysis, variable analysis that disaggregates outcome by pursuing, for example, active behavior for certain time periods rather than studying the entire regime over a long period of time as one unit of analysis. We see some efforts at applying what I call Boolean logic to map causal conjunction. For example, to study configuration of factors. If you are out asking, now what combination of factors are likely to provide for good performance, this is the kind of analysis that you could contemplate engaging in. And we see, I have a colleague at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo who is now doing a measured analysis of fisheries management, national fisheries management, by means of this kind of tool. And we're beginning to see some efforts, though by no means, I think, enough yet, of computational modeling. Computational modeling, trying to model a particular sequence of events, for example, to see what outcomes, see how we can understand outcomes. I'm not here to say that the solution to all our problems is to adopt one of these strategies. It certainly is not. But we're beginning to see, as we get a richer set of tools applied to the study of institutions, we're making progress simply because each of these techniques, each of these approaches do something others cannot do equally well. And if we are capable of combining them for which each of them does best, we will make, I trust, progress. Oran?
All right, let me move through a few slides just as quickly as possible so we can get on to discussion. As you can see, I'm from the University of California at Santa Barbara, where I'm involved in a program on governance for sustainable development, which may be interesting to people here. Now, Andreas already walked you through some of the International Human Dimensions Program projects. I just want to make one quick comment about this. At any given time in the Human Dimensions Program, we have a portfolio. And projects are conceptualized to last in the order of 10 years. And so our portfolio at any given time is completed projects, projects that are moving toward completion, younger projects, projects that are just beginning to take form, and new initiatives. The project called the Institutional Dimensions of Global Environmental Change, IHDP, as we call it, is a project that is now finished. It completed its cycle in 2007. The things that Arild was talking about are, in a sense, examples of the major findings or contributions of the IHDP project. We have a series of volumes in press that are intended to distill and make available easily the scientific legacy of this project. There will be a main synthesis volume which will come out from MIT Press September, October this year. Arild's chapter in that book focuses on these questions of causation, but there are other chapters, for example, on the question of institutional design, and also on some questions of what we call in the project fit, interplay, and scale, the extent to which the institutions are well matched to the biophysical and socioeconomic systems that they relate to. But what I want to say in just a few minutes' time is some things about a newly emerging project, which we see as in some measure the next kind of generation, which we call Earth System governance, growing out of our experience of the previous 10 years with IHDP. And maybe just say a couple of words about the relationship between the Earth System Governance Project and the predecessor, IHDP, a little bit about the focus on governance, what is meant by governance, a couple of comments on the themes, the analytical themes that Earth System Governance is saying, we believe these could be cutting-edge topics. Projects under the Human Dimensions Program are meant to identify, in the best judgment of the community, what we think are cutting-edge topics that are ripe for scientific advance at any given time. One or two comments about flagship activities, a word about the scientific planning process, and then something about timeline and engagement. How could you get engaged if you're interested to buy this? The relationship with IJEC, in this process that's gone on over the last 2 or 3 years, we've always come back to the conclusion that the way to describe the relationship is same, but different. And it captures quite nicely the Earth system governance clearly is, in some sense, a new generation that owes a lot to the IJEC project, but at the same time, like any good new generation, younger generation, it obviously needs to strike out on its own and find its own personality. So Earth system governance, and particularly in relationship to the institutional dimensions of the past, Earth system governance emphasizes this term governance in contrast to institutions, which was the touchstone in the sense of the earlier project. And it says that governance should somehow be seen as a somewhat broader umbrella than institutions. So institutions, of course, are very close to the heart of governance. But, well, governance in terms of some notion of steering societies, guiding societies toward collectively good outcomes and away from collectively bad outcomes, also involves a variety of things like knowledge, culture, norms, habits, and so forth. The project also, called Earth System Governance, takes a very lively interest in what we often call vertical interplay. Earth System Governance doesn't mean that the project looks exclusively at, for example, the UNFCCC, or just at governance systems defined at the global level. It sees governance as a multi-level phenomenon. As some of you may know, multi-level governance has become a concept, a term, an idea which is quite widely in circulation at the present time, referring to not only the different levels of social organization, but interactions across them. So, for example, when we look at climate change, we see things happening at the local level, things happening at the regional level, things happening at the national, international level, and how do these processes interact with each other? Is there some kind of upscaling from the sort of bottom up, or downscaling from the top down? So this multi-level governance, which, by the way, I think emerged in at least some part from earlier IJEC work, but is now seen as a kind of attractive, cutting-edge theme, is important to Earth System Governance. The team, the planning committee, which has been responsible for the creation of the Earth System Governance Science Plan, which I'll wave to you in a few minutes' time, has said, well, we have these kind of 5 big topics, 5 big themes. They've become known in the community working on this as the 5 A's, which sometimes seems perhaps a little forced, but nonetheless, these are the sort of substantive themes that the planning committee has, over a process of a couple of years, identified. One, architecture. This is very much similar to one of the points Arild ended up on institutional complexes, the notion that regimes, individual regimes, are embedded in kind of larger governance systems or complexes. Agency. There was a fairly strong sense in the community that the IJEC project, no matter how successful it may have been, tended to privilege states as actors in intergovernmental regimes and so on, which I think was perhaps a reasonable approach at the time, but now the community is saying we need to think more broadly about agency. We need to understand the roles of other kinds of actors, non-state actors and so on. Adaptiveness perhaps is a little stretch for reaching for an A, but one of the big ideas here is that regimes, governance systems and so on are quite highly dynamic. You don't just put them in place on day one and they kind of perform nicely and kind of stay the same. Let me get back to this. Yeah. Over time, they are often complex and dynamic systems. Oh, well, am I not getting back to you? And so an interesting topic is to understand the dynamics of governance systems. Accountability is a notion, of course, coming out of things like democratic theory and so on, is who answers to whom. Are these governances, Earth system governance, something that happens in the stratosphere and nobody exactly knows who's doing it and what their authority is and legitimacy and so on? What kinds of mechanism of accountability? And then the fifth one, access and allocation. There is a rather strong sense in at least part of the community that the IHDP project, the institutions project, was so concerned with these questions of effectiveness that Arild mentioned, and I feel very strongly that that was a strength of the project, but now people are saying, particularly coming out of the political science community, well, but what about who gets what? What about the distributive or allocative consequences? Even if we conclude that a regime has been effective, it doesn't mean that everybody benefits equally or evenly. And so shouldn't we pay more attention to these questions of allocation? Then just a word on flagship activities. Andreas mentioned that the governance theme has been thought of in the International Human Dimensions Program world as a kind of cross-cutting theme. And so there's been a very strong sense in the development of our system governance that what we really need to do is to stimulate cross-fertilization between people who bring the intellectual capital of governance, the social science community, but which can be brought to bear on applied issues and using some of the substance and empirical content of real-world questions. And so it happens not just in the International Human Dimensions community, but in the International Global Environmental Change Research community, which is a much broader thing than the Human Dimensions program. There are projects that deal with issues like the Global Carbon Cycle, GCP, the Global Carbon Project, GCAS, which is Global Environmental Change and Food Systems, GWSP, the Global Water System Project, GLP, the Global Land Project. These are all projects which have very strong kind of substantive thematic characteristics. And so we say, well, might there not be substantial value added, substantial new insight if we orchestrate a extensive and ongoing interaction between Earth system governance and these other projects, that the governance intellectual capital will help to illuminate these substantive problems, but coming to terms with these substantive problems may very well stimulate insights about governance. Okay, just to finish up fairly quickly here, what happens in the global change research community and certainly in the International Human Dimensions Program is that when a project is developing, it's in the sort of developmental stage, we appoint a scientific planning committee. And this is just to identify, because you will know some of these names to give you a sense of the players, who has been the sort of champions, the people who've done the lion's share of the work on Earth System Governance. The chair is a very capable, younger, at least looking at Arild and myself, younger scholar Frank Bren, who's from the Institute of Environmental Studies at the Free University of Amsterdam. And then just a timeline in engagement to finish up here. The draft science plan, which looks like this, nice thick document, is now out for final review. The International Human Dimensions Program has commissioned a set of people to review the document in the way you would review any scientific work. That is happening right now. There are several reviewers who are currently sitting at their desks looking and saying, my God, how long is this I have to review? Did I agree to do this? Our anticipation is that if all goes well, unless there's some sort of major upset that we don't foresee, that the science plan will be approved formally by the Scientific Committee of the International Human Dimensions Program probably in October. And that this will lead to the appointment of what we call the Scientific Steering Committee. So we move from a planning committee to an approved science plan to a steering committee, and that the project would begin operations, be open for business, give or take, come January 2009, and would have a life expectancy of something of the order of a decade. And I just want to conclude by saying that there are lots of opportunities for engagement of any interested individuals in this process. Even now, while the science plan is still under review, I just turned to Andreas and said the science plan, I believe, can be accessed from a website.
Yeah, once it is finalized.
But this draft is not accessible from the website?
From the ESG website?
This draft, I guess, is accessible by sending an email message to Frank Bierman.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if anybody says, boy, I can't wait for the science plan to be finalized, and I'd like to get into the picture, an email message to Frank
or to the secretary.
Or to the secretary. And then once this is finalized, the global environmental change programs are not meant to be the property of a few people. They're meant to be frameworks that are intended to engage people. And so anybody who's interested, for example, in any of the 5 A's or the cross-cutting perspective and so on would be urged and very welcome to get involved in the process. So that's a little bit of an overview of IHDP, some findings from a completed project, and some new directions.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation, for the overview, for the findings, and for the future. And I think the floor is open about any sort of questions. Marcus, first.
Two questions. One is a very concrete one to what you just said. I mean, you said opportunities for engagement, and I understood that, as you said, this is a very open program, but what exactly do you understand by possibilities for engagement? Just reading stuff, attending a conference, proposing a 5-year project with 10 people, or could you just substantiate that a little bit? And my second... And my second question is a more substantive one, or it's more a comment issue on which I would like you to comment. I was very much impressed by your 5A, most notably that you really got them to be A's. I mean, 5 themes is one thing, but starting with A is really an achievement.
That's Frank. Frank is the architect of the A's.
Okay, but my point is I have a 6th A for you. And that is the question and the comment. And that A is autonomy. My impression is, and I have to say a few words about it, my impression is that, at least when I look at the people sitting here, you are people who come very strongly from an international relations background. And international relations, I think, very boldly now. Cooperation is good. You know, cooperation is precarious, it's not taken for granted. The problem of global problems is that states or whatever actors do not cooperate for a variety of reasons. So if you get them to cooperate, that is already good. And this is, I think, very much of your institutional project. And that is, I think, an assumption that I widely share, but if we go a step further, and that is something that emerges very strongly from European Union studies, this cooperation can also have negative repercussion in a multi-level framing. And that is the impact on autonomy. You know? Because if you cooperate in one way or another, states, if I just may stick to traditional states, give up autonomy. They have to agree to rules, and again, in a very bold simplification, the more effective the rules, the more intrusive they are. And that exactly creates a problem for autonomy. And so the good cooperative solutions on the global level or on the macro-region level might have negative impact domestically. Are you having a look at that, and what do you think about this issue?
Shall I begin?
You presented the 5 days, so you should defend them as well.
Add anything? For the first on your engagement point, I'm glad you asked that question because it creates an opportunity to say that what the International Human Dimensions Program stands for is an evolution in social science research that follows a pattern which is perhaps more common in the natural sciences, which is to say the idea of, to use a phrase, big science. Science that involves sort of collaborative and coordinated work of a sizable number of people who agree to operate within the same conceptual and analytic framework. Very familiar process in the natural sciences, more of an emergent process in the social sciences. And of course one that will never, under any circumstances, replace individual investigator-initiated projects, but it's intended to be another channel, another line of analysis. And so one can be involved, of course, in workshops and seminars and conferences, but also in just getting connected to the community of people working on this theme and saying, well, I think I could frame some of my questions in a way that connected to what others are doing, and then starting to swim in that stream, which would inevitably involve concretely going to workshops and seminars and conferences and so on. The autonomy issue, I'll just make a couple of comments, and perhaps Arild would like to say something as well. You're absolutely right, of course, about the side effects or the consequences of effective governance at any level for the autonomy of others. And I guess we would be inclined to say that in a world of rising interdependencies, where the actions of individual actors at any level are likely to have more or less significant consequences for others, it's in some sense unavoidable if one develops effective governance at all. And it remains to be seen at some levels whether that will be the case, and it's not only international but local in some cases. But effective governance, almost by definition, in a sense, in a world of highly interdependent actors, means the imposition and the acceptance of limitations and restrictions on the autonomy of individual actors. And that, in a nutshell, is the situation at the global level with respect to things like climate change and so on, and where we're having such a struggle between defenders of autonomy, come hell or high water, both hell and high water in this case, versus those who are saying, look guys, we got a problem and you're going to have to accept some restraints and some abide by some kinds of rules. It's true, of course, that if you look at the trio sitting here, that we have a fairly strong origin in international relations, But one of the nice things about the governance research is that there is a rather strong community thinking about analytically similar questions at a number of different levels of social organization. So, for example, someone I collaborate with all the time and very closely is Eleanor Oslo. And Eleanor's work, as many of you, perhaps most of you, will know, is rooted empirically in local scale governance systems. And we've had a wonderful time over the last 20 years, really great time comparing and contrasting. Well, you find these design principles seem to work at the local level. Do they work at the global level? I find that it's not just regulation, but knowledge systems that make a difference at the global level. Do you find that at the local level? And that's part of the theme of kind of multi-level governance as well. In IHDP terms, we asked the question of scale. What scales up and what scales down from research conducted at different levels of organization. So this is meant to be a tent which is attractive to people coming from different levels in terms of their personal research programs. You want to add?
Maybe two quick footnotes. Again, I agree completely with your description. One footnote would simply be to add that what we see in the European Union and several other instances is in fact that some countries or some states which are already contemplating or ahead of others in a certain regulatory sense of the word tries to use the European Union system, the Commission, the Parliament, other mobilized NGOs as well in the system to have as community or union rules what they would like to see as the general policy. So they take advantage of these kinds of institutions to push others who are not enthusiastic in the beginning to adopt a certain type of common policy. And we see this happening in many instances as well. This basically means that when we study the impact of institutions, we should be more careful to make distinctions between different kinds of parties that are involved and differentiate effects. And I trust that that is consistent, at least, with what you just said. The second footnote is simply to add that if I were a constructivist, which I am not, this is the confessional part, I would say that there is some side to the coin. And that is that what happens is part of institutional, or is part of collaboration, cooperation, is that parties to some extent come to internalize certain values, norms, rules, and routines. So, yes, in a sense, they give up their autonomy, but they converge in wanting to do, or seeing as appropriate, the same mode of behavior. And I think in understanding the way also the European Union works, and I said I'm not a constructivist, and I don't consider myself a constructivist, but I think there's merit to that proposition. And so I think we have to keep in mind there are several aspects to this autonomy, voluntary internalization of norms kind of phrases.
Maybe a third footnote and final footnote from my side. First of all, I wouldn't necessarily draw the inference that IR research is necessarily normatively bound to the assumption that cooperation is good, because there is a neo-realistic theory still going on which doesn't necessarily draws these conclusions. Just as much I wouldn't say that your points are necessarily motivated by a neoliberal perspective on governance. More analytically, I think I also agree with Oran and Arild that this is a very important observation, but I wouldn't suggest to add a 6A It could, no, I think the questions of autonomy or sovereignty, as I would phrase it, belongs to allocation and others. Allocation of power, allocation of incentives and capabilities and so on. And allocation, by the way, in that sense is not limited to issues of equity and so forth. Of course, what you said about repercussions on the domestic scale is also true vice versa. So the choice of a given national government or regional governance system to yield a maximum of sovereignty and autonomy also has repercussions on the global system when it comes to solving problems around global public goods, climate and so on. Clearly this also affects the two levels, vice versa. And I consider myself as a constructivist, and I do believe that in a almost dialectical sense of the discourse, the tensions, sometimes the creative tensions between local scale governance solutions as opposed to global scale governance solutions have quite beneficial and creative impacts to both realms that could interplay nicely with one another. So I wouldn't put that into a rather exclusive either-or relation.
Okay. I would like, since there's no question currently, I would like just to follow on what we have debated. I mean, one thing is this autonomy issue. In my view, autonomy can be handled as a 6A, but it seems to me, with respect to a number of those issues, that you have here a very important, so to speak, interconnect. I mean, many of the things about the regime dynamics that we can observe today, the dynamics of international institutions in general, obviously, so it seems to me at least, have to do a lot with this felt loss of autonomy. I mean, the rise, that's probably not so clearly if you look only to international environmental institutions, which have a very positive reputation, but if you look to international economic institutions, for example, I mean, you can easily see a rise of protest and of resistance against international institutions. And I think here, autonomy is obviously a very, very important thing to consider. And I even would have doubts whether that can be responded or handled exclusively through the category of routinization, of internalization, because I mean it gets to some extent internalized on the side of the governments, but societal groups don't consider this as something that should be internalized, and therefore you create the kind of cleavage between society and government because of the fact that governments and administrations have internalized it to some extent. So I mean, I would highlight that autonomy is probably quite an important thing. And I also, because and that's my second point, and it also follows up on what Marcus has mentioned already, I still have one more question about this engagement issue. I mean, if I were a rational choice person, which I am to some extent, this is a subjunctive conversation. If I were, then I would ask the question about incentives. So if I would, for example, learn about the dynamics of international institutions, what kind of incentives do I have to engage in this kind of group who is working on these issues, which is already obviously a sort of group. What should bring people who work on related things to say, hello, here I am as well, please, can I come?
Okay. First, just one more comment on the first issue, autonomy and all that. There is quite a significant stream of research in the IHDP project, which developed under the conceptual umbrella of institutional interplay. And we tended to think when we developed the idea, developed this research theme, that interplay would typically be a source of conflict for these kinds of reasons, of giving up autonomy or having an impingement on your freedom to do things independently and so on. Obviously, there's much more research to be done, but the general message from RJEC is that this kind of interaction is sometimes conflictual, but actually quite often synergistic. That it's enabling. It allows parties to engage in joint or coordinated or integrated activities, which of course require giving up of some autonomy, but actually allow them to do things that they couldn't do otherwise. And so the next phase of research is really on kind of maybe it's along the lines of your variable notion. It has to do with sort of conditions, scope conditions, as you might call them methodologically as well. When is this likely to be synergistic? When is it likely to be conflictual? And that is in some sense a segue into your second point. Because the idea of engagement, the idea of becoming a part of a larger research stream has to involve or has to create a feeling of opportunity that there may be synergism, that we may be able collectively to advance some steps further in terms of our common quest for insights. So we generate knowledge, then we can if we each operate individually. Now, there are levels of engagement, of course. And there are levels of engagement which involve actually jointly produced written products. The scientific production is a joint production, and those of us who are active in the global environmental change research community certainly, as an empirical generalization, look at our CVs in recent years and discover more and more of our articles seem to have quite a few names on them. So, I mean, this is just a kind of an observation, but there's another level of engagement which I would say might be more of a kind of harmonization or coordination. You say, well, I don't want to become co-authors with those guys. That's too much loss of autonomy there. But on the other hand, it might be interesting to frame some of my own research agenda in a way in terms of questions asked, variables emphasized, even operationalizations. I mean, we know from past history and thinking about issues of institutional governance that there are many research projects which look like they're going to be cumulative. You say, wow, this is going to really add to cumulative. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty, and when you start to say, well, okay, the terms are similar, but what about the operationalizations? You say, oh gosh, you know, these two data sets are going to be hard to interpret as information pertaining to the same questions, and therefore difficult to accumulate. We're spending the day here today because of two long-term research projects which a number of us, including Michael, have been involved with, in asking our question, can we integrate the findings? What does it mean that sometimes these projects converge when they produce answers to some questions, but differ when they produce answers to other questions? Is this an artifact of the non-harmonization of the projects, or is it a real substantive difference which calls for a new round of research? And then, of course, there are always going to be, should be, and God knows it's fine with me, people who don't want to engage at all, want to be saying autonomy is their top value, and their trade-off function is, it's a little bit of giving up of autonomy is really pricey in terms of anything I'm going to get out of it in terms of collaboration. That's cool. That's going to happen. So this is another kind of variable, I guess, Michael, is the engagement variable.
But that's an E, that's not an A. That's a problem, isn't it?
The A's are Frank's side. I don't feel duty bound by A's.
I'll have applied mine in this order. I don't know exactly.
Thanks so much. I was wondering behind which A is hidden the human dimension, since the human dimension figures so prominently in the title of the project. Where does it come in then under this list of A's?
In all of them.
In all of them. Yeah, maybe you can elaborate. The second question is, one of your declared missions is to link research and policy. And you indicated that you also made a contribution to the climate change panel. So what was this sort of new finding that emerged from your research that you offered to the panel?
I take the first question and I give you the second question. You got the first question about where is the human dimension. I mean governance, as we conceive of it, is a human activity. Now it may involve trying to steer or guide systems that are in part or perhaps even mostly biophysical in nature. But the governance dimension of all this is all human dimension. It's all anthropogenic. It's all social in character. So this is meant to be pervasive across the whole domain. Science policy.
Yeah, looking at the IPCC in particular, if you look at the whole history of the IPCC from AR1 to AR4 last year, of course it's all started out with what is now being called Working Group 1, related research on biophysical, biochemical, cycles, and so it has been largely due to, quote, our community that something like the Working Group 2 work on vulnerability, societal impacts and so on has evolved over time as a distinctive field of research and as a field to be addressed by policymakers. That has been, if you will, a long-term contribution. Now looking at AR4 2007 in particular, we counted about 30 authors, most of them new authors that contributed chapters to the mainly Working Group 2 related research, and again literally taking findings and perspectives from all of IHDP's projects. And that is to some extent even true for working through a mitigation, looking at sustainability, experiments, industrial transformation, phase transition questions and so forth. But we are now going beyond that, and that is even the more exciting perspective. And I briefly mentioned that the IPCC actually approached us and said, could we partner in a project that would identify true research gaps that we ought to understand if we want to address the future challenges of climate change that are best addressed by the social sciences. That is a very interesting, daunting task now for the years to come. And the IPCC internally did a assessment, a gap analysis, and I recently had a meeting with Chori, and he admitted or stated that about 70–75% of the research gaps that should be addressed when moving towards the New Scenarios Initiative and the AR5 are social science research gaps. And it just underlines the growing importance of our type of research. So, but that is just one example, it's a very prominent one, and there are others with other UN agencies.
Let me say a bit about this too. I would say that the emphasis now is on the conceptualization and framing of AR5 and thinking about how the human dimensions can and should contribute. For example, we've been having, as you probably know, lots of discussions about the inadequacies of the existing stress scenarios. And it's very clear that a successor generation of those scenarios needs to have strong human dimensions input. I think the growing emphasis on adaptation is putting human dimensions front and center. We have an interaction which is not always completely smooth, but what is in the world completely smooth, with the IPCC about how we should engage. And there, I think, one of the interesting points, and it's true of our general growth of interest in the science policy interface, is that the science policy interface is not just about delivering scientific findings to the policy community. The science policy interface is about the whole relationship from the identification of research questions, but the identification in the policy community of what they need to know. What are their concerns? And so we are promoting quite strongly the sense of a kind of an end-to-end relationship between the science community and the policy community. IPCC, I think, is a very good example of that, but there are many other examples as well. So we have I'm very excited about this, because it's a much richer dialogue than just we scientists coming along to the policymakers saying, well, we want to tell you what we know, that you should do something about. It's a much more productive relationship that goes in both directions.
A very current example is the, again, UNFCCC subsidiary body on science and technology, SABSTA, that is meeting in a couple of weeks in Bonn. So we have established a standing relationship that each year we are called upon to engage in a dialogue again with the parties up to the convention about real-time research needs. And that's very interesting because, of course, the IPCC is considered the prime body for science assessment, but the parties are more and more concerned about real-time delivery of knowledge and dialogue about research needs, during the phases where ARs are prepared. So that is an example of this kind of two-way interaction with parties. So I go there, I brief them, they raise concerns, and the US delegation says what they don't want to know, and others tell us what they want to know. And it's quite exciting. It's a new trend that we have this real-time interaction.
Okay, I mean, I would say we have two more, and we take them together, and then we have a session. I would this first, and then
I would just make a statement saying that regime design could be used as a recipe for effective problem solving, and you relativized that statement by saying, well, sometimes regimes are contributing to effective problem solving. That's something that I want to emphasize before I would like to raise two questions related to this. Well, by relativizing this statement, I think you relativized already the kind of steering optimism that one could accuse of institutionalists who are primarily emphasizing that regime design is the key factor for achieving effective problem solving. And we know that, well, if we look at all the things that don't function very well in our world as a result of the work of international governance institutions, we have in fact to admit that, well, global governance is not always producing effective results. Having said that, I think the question arises whether your project or the larger program, how far this program is also focusing on cases of failure, regime failure or failure regarding problem solving. Do you have particular case studies that are also trying to explore under what conditions institutions fail. And second, related to this, is the question, well, do you also, or to what extent do you explore the constraints that may lead to suboptimal outcomes of international governance systems that are not related to classical factors like regime design, but that may be located on the social level, for instance?
Yeah, Robert.
I just wanted to ask a question to follow up on the policy aspect and influencing policy. And I heard a lot coming back from some of the previous questions about the United Nations and the UNFCCC, but was wondering, to my mind, that it seems a little bit, perhaps I'm missing something, but that seems a little bit roundabout, because when we go to the UN, then this information then trickles back to the nation states, and then goes back to the UN. And I was just wondering if there was any kind of idea maybe of going, and maybe this is again kind of beyond the mandate or kind of undermine the mandate of going directly from your research straight to member states and then having them bring in. And I was just wondering if that's something that's undertaken or if that's...
So, Arild, you want to respond to
maybe I could just add a few words, but as a preface to what I'm going to say, I want to share with you a small episode from this morning. So Michael walked into the room and I recapped our discussion about the two volumes, and I told him that my students had read it too. They came out saying that the Breitmeyer Young Servant volume portrayed a more optimistic picture of global environmental governance than the Myers, Underdal, etc. volume. And Mikael's immediate question was, have you controlled for the personalities involved in drafting and writing these books? And that's a non-trivial observation, actually, because sometimes people come into this from different perspectives, not necessarily with personality differences, but because they enter with a different academic background. And some of us coming from previous studies in which we tend to think that what can go wrong will, and others taking a more optimistic view on that. Now, then to the question, I think it is a very important question, because there is inadvertently a selection bias in much of the institutional research, understandably, in the sense that if we are to study how institutions work, we often go to instances where institutions can be observed at work. Now, if we want to address the question more broadly, what's the role of certain types of institutions in global environmental governance or in providing sustainability? We have to study the absence of institutions as well as the presence. And that means that we would have to select as unit of analysis problems or challenges or issue areas rather than institutions. Now, I'm not saying that one is wrong and the other is right. What I'm saying is that those two mechanisms of selection would give us slightly different, or perhaps substantially different, images of what institutions do. And I have indicated earlier, and I think it's right, that an outsider coming in, reading through some of the case study literature, particularly that we have about international environmental regimes and institutions, may inadvertently get a more rosy picture than a person would get if he or she asked the different question. Now look at all the problems we have. The certain selection type of problems, and ask what kind of roles, what kind of contribution did certain types of institutions deliver in this particular context. And we need both types of research. We need these kind of studies that focuses specifically on institutions and examine how they work. But we also need this more extensive type of analysis that goes to problems. The unit of analysis is the problem or the challenge. Now, what explains or accounts for success or failure? And what is the role more specifically of regimes, organizations, or leadership for that matter in addressing these problems?
How does new knowledge travel?
Okay, glad you raised the question about science policy. A few observations and facts. A more structured strategic approach with regard to science policy interaction is relatively new to the program. I think the past scientific committee of the IHDP in the beginning chose very wisely to be restricted a bit to the ivory tower of good science, high quality science, before broadcasting too loud, what would have been a bit premature. That said, we are still experimenting on it. We are not a boundary organization, we are not a think tank. I know the business because I used to work, for instance, here with Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik, so clearly we are not doing that. But we realize that we have almost a responsibility to interact with the end users, and there our understanding is relatively broad. It is not restricted to UN member states, it is not restricted to international organizations, but we understand policy also as something that occurs at the level of corporations, NGOs and so forth, and that is why we have a relatively broad stakeholder concept, and we engage with all of those types. For instance, we will in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks hold our next science policy dialogue on energy issues in Santa Barbara, California, and we've invited people from the World Bank, various governments, as much as NGOs, media, and business who will, companies like that are interested in green policy. So we're not as restricted to the UN, and we also are in, since we are also funded by a number of countries, naturally partners with the German Ministry for Science, with the US National Science Foundation. So yes, of course, we do that as well.
Okay, two lines in each of the questions. Helmut's question, operationalization is difficult, but surely failure and success needs to be treated as a variable, and not as just a dichotomy. And surely there are ample cases of failure at all levels of social organization. I mean, local, regional, national governments make a mess with great regularity, as well as the international levels. On the science policy issue, in the last several years I've taught from time to time a seminar called Science Policy and the Environment. It's fascinating. It's a hugely interesting subject. But the one point I wanted to make just in closing is that I found it quite useful to, at least for heuristic purposes, make use of the policy cycle concept, different stages of the policy process. And it's very clear that the role or the kinds of things that science can contribute to policymaking varies quite significantly from one stage of the policy process to another. And that's a very useful observation to make, because it helps us to kind of understand where there's a significant likelihood that we can make a difference.
I think this was a very interesting and I think also very stimulating presentation about a certainly very important project. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the presentation and for the discussion.